Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Kim, and thanks to all of you for the invitation to be here today with you at this very prestigious forum. It's a particular pleasure for me to take part at the suggestion of my good friend, Professor Wu Xinbo of Fudan University. I first met Professor Wu in the 1990s through the late Dr. Mike Oxenberg, one of America's great sinologists, and the senior NSC official for China when our two countries established official diplomatic relations. And I benefited from Professor Wu's insights ever since. I'm also very pleased to see that the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies is this forum's sponsor, underscoring the potential for constructive regional ties, the theme of this event. Last year, during his visit to the United States, President Xi Jinping introduced the idea of a new type of great power relationship. In March of this year, in apparent response, President Obama and his National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, suggested an interest in building a new model of relations between an existing power and an emerging one. Now, I suspect that President Xi's concept reflects the senior leadership's study of history. At last year's meeting of the U.S.-China Strategic Economic Dialogue, then President Hu stated, quote, "We should prove that the traditional belief that big powers are bound to enter into conflict is wrong, and instead seek new ways of developing relations between major countries in this era of economic globalization." In the United States, Professors Graham Allison and Joseph Nye at Harvard have referred to this challenge as the Thucydides trap. In explaining the cause of the Great Peloponnesian War of the 5th century BC, Thucydides pointed to the rise of Athens and the fear that it inspired in Sparta. In centuries ever since, scholars have pondered how power shifts have led to competitive tensions, which sometimes have been managed while others have led to conflict. Today, I will pose a question based on President Xi's suggestion. What might be the substance of a new type of great power relationship between China and the United States? My friend Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia, has also taken up this topic in a series of thoughtful speeches. Mr. Rudd has outlined a new strategic roadmap for U.S.-China relations. His approach points to the need for reinforcing dialogues and cooperative efforts. I will complement Mr. Rudd's observations by suggesting specific policies that could forge this new type of relationship. And in particular, I will focus on both economic and security issues, as well as impediments that China and the United States need to address. In 2005, I suggested that the United States and others should encourage China to become a responsible stakeholder in the international system that had provided a supportive context for China's extraordinary modernization and economic rise. Deng Xiaoping had shrewdly recognized that China's opening could capitalize on the existing international system of trade, investment, technology, growth, and security. And through the hard work of China's people, Deng Xiaoping was proven correct. Yet the international system of the late 20th century has to evolve with new times. Responsibilities for preserving and extending systemic interests and adapting to new challenges need to be considered part of great powers' national interests. The United States, China, and others, however, will not be able to adapt the system successfully if they do not share a basic commitment to that international system. Some observers have believed that China has acted like a reluctant stakeholder, especially when it comes time to translating common interests into complementary policies. In speculating why, they've asked, is China still debating or adapting to its role? Or, as some voices in China suggest, does China want a new system? If so, what would it look like? Does China want to add a different ideological content to international relations? which would represent a shift from past Chinese policy. These uncertainties have prompted another important query. Have Chinese critics of the current international system considered the costs of and reactions by others to new Chinese aims? Not surprisingly, these questions are arising first in the Asia-Pacific region. Therefore, in considering a possible new type of great power relationship, we need to have a serious, in-depth exchange about whether China and the United States share common systemic interests, as well as about specific policies. Interdependence by itself will not overcome 21st century problems and threats. These questions fit the agenda of the Shanghai Forum because the nature of Sino-American relationships will shape Asia's security, development, and politics, as well as Asia's connections with the world. Now, China's astounding economic success, growing on average 10% a year for 30 years, has propelled it to become the second largest economy in the world, the second largest trader of goods and services, and the second largest recipient of foreign direct investment. The United States, in turn, still accounts for about 22% of global GDP. Although productivity gains are harder to achieve as advanced economies move to the technological frontier, recent American innovations in energy, software, business models reveal a developed economy that retains unusual capacities to adapt and revitalize itself. In contrast to most other developed economies, and even many developing ones, the United States' demographic outlook is modestly positive. U.S. integration with its North American partners also offers good prospects. Yet the combination of global structural shifts, in particular the rapid rise of developing economies, along with the stumbling global revival from the Great Recession, necessitate more changes for China, the United States, and the world. China's developmental challenges are described well in the China 2030 report released last year. That report was prepared by the Development Research Center of the State Council, along with other Chinese ministries, and an international team from the World Bank Group. The basic problem the researchers were trying to solve was how China could avoid the so-called middle-income trap. That's the tendency for productivity and growth to slow after developing economies reach middle-income levels. Our Chinese colleagues wisely recognized that straight-line growth projections rarely come to pass. Consider this problem in a historical perspective. When the World Bank reviewed the performance of 101 economies that the bank had categorized as middle income in 1960, it discovered that by 2008, almost 50 years later, only 13 had made it to high income, and one of those was Greece. China has relied heavily on the investment in fixed assets, principally by the government, and export-led growth. So China will need to adapt to global structural shifts. Now that developing economies account for half of global output, and indeed about 2/3 of global growth over the past 5 years, China can no longer base its growth model principally on sales to developed economies. China needs to change its growth model to rely on greater domestic demand and consumption, as well as a greater role for the private sector. Investment in human capital will be of increasing importance, and so will the encouragement of the innovative spirit of China's talented people. This shift could enable more Chinese to benefit from their decades of diligence. In doing so, increased consumption might ease social tensions as well. The China 2030 report outlined a pathway to a new growth model, including completing the transition to markets for land, labor, enterprises, and financing, moving to an open innovation system so as to enable China to move up the value chain, offering equal opportunity and basic social protections to all Chinese, restructuring fiscal systems to match accountability for revenue and expenditures at various levels of government, cleaning up the environment and pricing resources for scarcity, and considering the international implications of China's structural shifts. I do not expect China's new leaders to act through a big bang reform. I do think that they and the provincial leaders will pursue pragmatic experimentation. Premier Li Keqiang has pointed to urbanization as the portal through which China can pursue connected change, combining issues of land, labor, enterprises, education and other services, consumption, living standards, new infrastructure, housing, sustainability, financing, and governance. Even recognizing the need for change is a very big step forward. In contrast, over 20 years ago, I watched Japan's political and bureaucratic system resist the need for a new growth model. And now Prime Minister Abe is having to take bold steps to rectify Japan's past resistance to change. Yet China's next reform push will be difficult. The Chinese leadership will need to maintain balancing growth in the near term by relying principally on the current economic structure while changing that structure for future growth. A new type of great power relationship would anticipate the economic and even institutional changes that lie ahead. China and the United States should identify mutual interests in supporting structural reform and rebalancing in both economies. Consider what a new cooperative economic approach might reveal. For example, to boost productivity, create jobs, expand entrepreneurial opportunities, and increase consumption, China needs to open competition in the services sector. The Chinese private sector should expand its role. In addition, U.S. and other foreign businesses and investors can bring know-how, technologies, and global connections to support expanded Chinese services sector. And this cooperation can alleviate trade imbalances and frictions while promoting mutual interests. China's innovation agenda needs to combine education, technologies, venture capital, network effects, and better IPR protection and enforcement. And again, U.S. participation could assist while benefiting the United States and others too. Stronger but flexible social safety nets in China could draw from international experience in insurance, savings, and delivery of service models. The United States, in turn, needs to address the costs, financing, and incentives of its older and much more expensive safety nets. China's food needs and water conservation could be assisted by U.S. and foreign products, technologies, and systems, including for stronger food safety and quality. More open markets should expand the complementarity of trans-Pacific agribusiness while boosting living standards. There are mutual opportunities in energy and the environmental sectors, including lower carbon sources, alternative technologies, and systems and experience for clean air, water, biodiversity, and land use. And all these adaptations need to be supported by deeper, more diverse, and more liquid markets for savings, credit, and investment, while ensuring safety, soundness, and effective crisis management. China needs to shift from being a nation of savers with minimal returns to becoming a nation of investors who play a role in China's private sector development. And China, the United States, and others need better frameworks to encourage cross-investment while managing national security and other sensitivities. In a sense, China's 21st century leaders can look to the logic of Deng Xiaoping and Zhu Ranji, employing the markets, rules, competition, opportunities, and standards of the international economy to contribute to China's structural reforms and advancement. The United States also needs structural reforms, especially in pension and healthcare systems, tax reform, public-private partnerships for infrastructure, and education connected to skills and jobs. U.S. entitlement programs now cost every man, woman, and child in America $7,400 each year, more than China's income per person. China and the United States each have very good, self-interested reasons to pursue these structural reforms. Yet cooperation can boost mutual prospects and the likelihood of success. Moreover, the effectiveness of Chinese and U.S. reforms will boost global economic conditions and enhance the likelihood of structural reforms elsewhere. My sense is that the U.S.-Chinese economic dialogues, whether under the headings of strategic, joint commercial, G20, APEC, WTO, or other fora, have become too stilted, too defensive, unimaginative. China's new growth agenda and America's recovery offers an opportunity. Both parties need to explore win-win connections. Not all ideas will prove workable, but a new type of relationship could seek creative openings and solutions. Moreover, as the two major economic powers, developed and developing, the United States and China need to consider how their cooperation can catalyze improved regional and global systems. For example, moves to open up China's services sector, which are in China's own interests, could be deployed to boost the service sector liberalization negotiations in the WTO. The WTO information technology agreements in the 1990s proved to be a great boon to global sourcing, supply chains, logistics systems, innovation, and consumers. The WTO members are now discussing an ITA 2 to update the old product list and to add services. China and the United States should be driving this effort. There are other opportunities, too, from trade facilitation measures to rules for more open government procurement. There will be increasing pressure to clarify the rules of fair competition for state-owned enterprises. A few years ago, sovereign wealth funds demonstrated that steps towards increased transparency and encouraging best practices could counter anxieties while improving overall performance. The United States and China need to be discussing the future international monetary system as well. That system has to adjust to both global shifts and the consequences of today's extraordinary monetary policies. The world needs to be on the watch for competitive currency devaluation. As China internationalizes the renminbi and moves towards an open capital account, a new era of great power relations will require the major economies to manage the evolution to a multiple reserve currency system. China and the United States have experience and perspectives on development that could assist other countries, whether through natural resource development, agriculture, expanded manufacturing and supply chains, service sector development, infrastructure, or investment. China and the United States have a common interest in inclusive growth, good governance, transparency and anti-corruption, rule of law, trade, and avoiding boom-bust cycles. This new era could foster cooperation with multilateral institutions and with private sector networks. Environmental topics need to be explored too, from biodiversity and wildlife conservation to low-carbon development. Frankly, if the United States and China are at odds on topics that require cooperation across national borders, the international system is unlikely to act effectively. If China and the United States can cooperate, even if just step by step, others are likely to join in. The economic agenda for a new type of great power relationship could be very extensive. There will be sensitivities and differences to manage, but the expanded network of economic ties, whether governmental, private, transnational, multilateral, well, these can be a source for problem-solving ideas, creativity, and some cushion to absorb the inevitable differences. But China and the United States do not have such a network to deal with security issues, whether bilaterally or multilaterally. I think this gap can be traced in part to a structural difference. In China, the People's Liberation Army reports to the Central Military Commission, a party institution with only 1 or 2 civilians. And I have observed that China's senior foreign policy officials, even up to the level of state counselor, are unlikely to be able to intervene on security topics until after the PLA has acted, and sometimes only after damage has been done to China's foreign relations. China does not have a National Security Council system to integrate security, foreign, defense, and even economic and political considerations. As a result, there's no institutional Chinese counterpart for what elsewhere would be described as political military or Pol-Mil discussions. At times, China and the United States have had military-to-military exchanges, but these are not yet at the appropriate levels. And China turns the discussions off and on to register displeasure, and that inhibits the in-depth exchanges and trust that need to be forged. Moreover, a new type of great power security relationship necessitates much more than discussions among militaries. Some Chinese officials and scholars have recognized the need for fuller integration of Chinese views on security and foreign policy topics. The Chinese system might, for example, look to a member of the Standing Committee of the Politburo to interconnect defense, foreign policy, security, and international economic topics, drawing together the PLA, officials of the government, and the party. Or the party leadership might rely on subcommittees. However it's structured, a political military discussion between China and the United States could supplement a renewed strategic dialogue. The current dialogue has taken up important topics, but too briefly, too infrequently, and with limited engagement at the highest levels, where the strategic decisions are likely to be made. The most effective Sino-American strategic exchanges, such as Kissinger-Zhou, Brzezinski-Deng, have been small and involve many, many hours of conversation to develop a greater understanding of worldviews, interests, and conceptual frameworks. A true high-level strategic discussion, including political military dimensions, should foster a dialogue on historical perspectives, geographic considerations, economic dimensions, technological shifts, political constraints, perceptions of changing conditions, national interests, and a search for mutual interests. It could also assist China and the United States to manage differences. In such a dialogue, the United States should offer a clear explanation why U.S. policies are not based on a containment strategy, as some Chinese seem to think. The United States should also explain its strategic concept of relations with China, and why, while hedging policies by the United States and others could be a reasonable reaction to worrisome Chinese behavior. Most importantly, the United States and China have mutual interests that they should at least understand and perhaps even foster together. For example, these interests might include freedom of the seas and maritime security, which is important for China's international economic interests, regional stability, and important for U.S. linkages as a maritime and Pacific power with Eurasia. Open skies and access to outer space so as to facilitate movement of people, goods, and information, which are important to our economies and security. Access to reasonably priced energy sources, including the development, transit, and safe use of resources. This interest is served by security stability in the Gulf, multiple energy sources and pipelines, sea lane security, technological development, and energy efficiency. Development of other resources in conjunction with social and environmental safeguards while managing disputes over territories and ownership. Establishment of a sense of security for other partners in the Asia-Pacific so as to avoid destabilizing and potentially threatening military competition or miscalculation. Non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, especially to states or terrorists that will endanger regional and global peace and stability. And countering violent Islamic radical movements while encouraging Islamic leaders who seek peaceful development with respect for religious beliefs. This identification of interests should be complemented by a sharing of assessments of threats to those interests, and then perspectives on how to deal with those threats. Yet these mutual interests, and even deep economic interdependence, could be overwhelmed by a failure to deal with differences in the Asia-Pacific. The challenge for U.S. and Chinese leaders is to use global cooperation as an incentive to reduce regional frictions, rather than to permit regional tensions to undermine their global cooperation. China has an interest in the security of its coastal approaches and in gaining influence in the Western Pacific. The United States has a network of alliance and partner countries that value the stability and economic security provided by America's presence. These alliance ties are important to America's regional and global standing, and that has reassured others. Therefore, China's relations with some neighbors, including Japan, cannot be separated from U.S. relations with China or U.S. relations with its allies. At the same time, these U.S. partners, like the United States itself, value their economic, political, and cultural ties to China. Today, China's Asian allies are few, poor, unreliable, and often isolated. U.S. allies are prosperous and expanding. If China's assertion of influence is interpreted as a threat to others, China will inevitably evoke a counter-reaction. To avoid creating its own encirclement, China has an interest in building ties with U.S. allies and friends, not in increasing their fears. And the United States and China together have an interest in fostering regional integration within a global system, without threats that weaken confidence or escalate tensions. It seems that the countries of Southeast Asia recognize the mutual benefits of economic integration within a safe security framework. Yet the differences over resource development are spilling over into fears about maritime security. None of the parties should have an interest in escalating anxieties or conflict. They should share an interest in negotiated cooperative solutions. Northeast Asia, however, poses serious dangers. North Korea, with a failed economy and uncertain leadership, has used threats and nuclear weapons to demand assistance while mobilizing an isolated garrison state. Its international trade in dangerous weapons and illegal activities has created havoc elsewhere. North Korea has rejected the 1953 armistice. It has used military force against South Korea twice in recent years, killing people and risking escalation that could slip out of control. North Korea has threatened preemptive strikes against South Korea and the United States while endangering Japan, and tested nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles that it could use to implement those threats. Now, China has traditionally believed North Korea offers a security buffer, but this is outdated logic. An invasion of China is not conceivable. Conflict precipitated by North Korea is increasingly conceivable, and certainly not in China's interests. When Dai Bingguo and I had strategic discussions in 2005 and 2006, I suggested that the United States would be content if North Korea became like China. And how could China object to that? Moreover, I pointed out that if the Koreas are ever unified, however the process came about, China would then have an interest in the United States retaining a security alliance with Korea. This alliance would reassure Koreans who have seen throughout their history that their peninsula served as a route for the militaries of much bigger neighbors. If a unified Korea inherited a nuclear weapon, the U.S. alliance with Korea could be instrumental in persuading it not to become another nuclear power. A nuclear Korea would leave Japan as the only Northeast Asian country without nuclear weapons, a situation that would worry the Japanese. Moreover, I told Dai Bingguo that it was my expectation, contrary to some Chinese speculation, that a U.S. alliance with a unified Korea would be backed by air and naval assets in the south, not large land forces, and certainly not troops on the Yalu. In contrast, if the U.S. alliance with Korea ended, Japan might eventually be concerned about being the sole Asian host to U.S. bases and forces. Now, that was years ago. Chinese and U.S. strategists need to be having these discussions about security in Northeast Asia now to head off dangers and prepare for a safer tomorrow. I suspect, for example, that one reason behind China's reluctance to press North Korea to end its hostile acts and begin reforms is a concern about being able to manage the process of change in North Korea. Perhaps South Korea and the United States and others in the region could discuss the possibilities for change with China. While China may wish to avoid considering this prospect, the reality is that a threatening North Korea will prompt responses by others that conflict with China's preferences for regional security. Yet all these substantive proposals for a new type of great power relationship are likely to be stillborn unless China and the United States remove a corrosive that is eating away at our trust and ties: cybersecurity. Cybersecurity anxieties take different forms, which compound a rising risk of confrontation. One dimension is espionage. A second is commercial espionage, which the U.S. and other sources believe is rampant, extremely costly, and destructive. A third is sabotage. And a fourth is the question of cyber warfare and whether and how principles of war such as hot pursuit, collateral damage, proportionality, and unacceptable damage apply in this area. Decades ago, with the advent of nuclear weapons, security strategists developed doctrines and theories to manage the risks of mass destruction. I don't know whether cybersecurity lends itself to similar discussions. I do know that it is vital that the great powers of the 21st century discuss how they might deal with these issues, which could otherwise undermine President Xi Jinping's suggestion of how to respond to history's lessons. There is a debate in the United States about whether China's very concept of international relations can ever accept a system based on rules that support an integrative approach. Some, including Dr. Henry Kissinger, believe that China's view of itself as a middle kingdom only allows for tributary relations. Now, the difference in perspective may reflect in part variations in experiences on economic and security issues. Economic policymakers have observed how Deng Xiaoping employed the international economic system as an enabler of dramatic internal reforms. And Zhu Rongji even went further, using China's WTO accession to import international economic rules and relationships. Similarly, China's economic relations and actions over the past 5 years of economic crisis have been generally cooperative. In my time at the World Bank Group, I also saw China's support for and willingness to adapt to multilateral development institutions and issues prompted by China's economic rise. The experience with security topics raises more doubts, perhaps leading to the differences in perceptions about China's concepts of international relations in the 21st century. The idea of a new type of great power relationship does not answer these questions, but it does offer us an opportunity to explore various answers. And it's not only China that brings a special historical perspective to this task. The United States, although it is the established power, is not a status quo power. Many international observers are confused about this American quality. Commentators ask why the United States, the largest and most powerful country, doesn't simply want to preserve the existing order. One symbol of America's global engagement is the $1 bill. And if you look at the back of that bill, you'll see a picture of the Great Seal of the United States. That seal, that was approved by the U.S. Congress in 1782, includes a Virgilian motto: Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of Ages. As my professor of diplomatic history pointed out long ago, much of American history is about whether this new order is supposed to be geographically limited to the just created United States or broadly applicable. In addition to security and power and freedom to trade and dollar diplomacy, American foreign policy has at times sought to promote the principles of the 18th century Enlightenment that were embodied in America's Revolution. Today, those principles are reflected in discussions about human rights and freedoms, but also topics that China is debating, including good governance, limits on arbitrary governmental action, and the rule of law. The challenge of crafting this new type of great power relationship is intriguing. It involves much more than a new balance of power. China is a rising power, but one guided by many traditional views. The United States is an established power, but one that seeks change. Both the United States and China are highly successful economies, deeply interconnected with many other countries and regions. Their relations will affect many others in the world. I hope that the ideas I offered today at the Shanghai Forum will contribute to the effort to avoid the Thucydides trap and the exploration of a new type of great power relationship, perhaps even a subject of discussion for the two presidents in June. This could be an exciting venture, and I look forward to hearing your perspectives. Thank you.